Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled 7,300 Miles, Why California's GABA Therapeutics Conducted Clinical Trials in Australia. My name is Samaya Sheikh and I'll walk you through some ground rules before we go ahead and get started. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the question chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please also note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over controls to our moderator for today, and that's Michelle Gallagher. Go right ahead, Michelle. The floor is all yours.
Welcome to our webinar. My name is Michelle Gallagher and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm a veteran of the Australian biotech sector and in particular an advocate for the clinical trials sector within that industry. Today it's a really great day to introduce you to a number of speakers, but before we do that I just want to acknowledge and welcome the country. It's what we do in Australia. And in that, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we each meet and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So 7,300 miles, why California's GABA Therapeutics conducted clinical trials in Australia, and that's the story that we're going to explore today. I'm really delighted that you've chosen to log in and spend some time with us, and I hope this webinar offers you some insight into the value and the opportunity that Australia offers to the biotech sector in terms of clinical trials and support within the industry in Australia. So to set the scene today, I'm going to introduce you to our panel of Australian speakers and in particular to the leadership team at GABA Therapeutics, which is based in California, who selected Australia as the key destination to cite their recently completed Phase 1/2A double-blind placebo-controlled single and multiple dose study in healthy volunteers in Melbourne in Australia, on time and slightly ahead of budget. So today you're going to hear from 4 organisations. The first is Nucleus Network, which is a powerhouse of Australian early phase clinical trials spread around the country. 360 Biolabs, which is Australia's most comprehensive specialty laboratory service organisation for therapeutic, vaccine and diagnostic development. CoSec, the matchmaker in this, linking Australian and US organisations supporting compliance and efficiencies for life science companies. And GABA Therapeutics, a Californian-based biotech developing novel therapeutics for neuropsychiatric, neurologic and pain disorders. So let's introduce the panel to you to kick off our conversation. So I'll give you a little bit of insight who we're talking to. So first of all, we've got Ian Massey, who's the CEO of GABA Therapeutics, and Ian has over 40 years experience in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, formerly head of research and early development for Roche. He was founder and CEO of Cynosia and sits on the board of directors and scientific advisory committee of several companies. We also have Richard Farrell, who's the Chief Financial Officer of GABA Therapeutics. He's a former investment banker, but we're not going to hold that against him. With over 25 years of experience in corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and capital raises in Australia and the US. Richard has been founder and CFO of several companies and is co-founder of GABA Therapeutics. We're also going to introduce you to Dr. Paul Griffin. He's a principal investigator and medical director at Nucleus Network's Brisbane site, so up in the more tropical end of Australia, where he's overseen more than 100 clinical trials, predominantly in infectious diseases. He's the Director of Infectious Diseases at Mater Health Services in Brisbane and conjoint Associate Professor at the University of Queensland School of Medicine and Affiliate Associate Professor at the Mater Research Institute. Paul has fellowships in infectious diseases from the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, in clinical microbiology from the Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia and from the Australasian College of Tropical Medicine. We're also going to introduce you to Angela Luttick, who's a virologist with more than 20 years' experience in the discovery, development and commercialisation of novel drugs. She's well accustomed to leading multidisciplinary teams and experienced in the generation and integrity of key discovery stage biological data required for the preparation of IND packages and used in filing numerous FDA submissions. Angela's co-founder and executive director at 360 Biolabs and leads business development and strategy for the company's growth. And last but by no means least, I'm going to introduce you to Blair Lucs. As CEO of CoSec, Blair's responsible for the overall operation of that business. He manages a range of overseas clients throughout Southeast Asia, Greater China, UK, Europe and the US. He's currently company secretary and nominee director for over 30 companies operating in Australia. Blair applies his in-depth knowledge of the Australian corporate regulatory environment to help offshore companies establish a presence here. So to our audience, please feel very welcome to post your questions into the chat and we'll look out for them during our conversation. And also remember, we'd love you to connect with any of our presenters here today, whether it's through their website or whether it's through LinkedIn. So please feel very welcome to drop any of us a line to say hi and start having a chat to us about what you would like to do in Australia. So first of all, I'm going to turn our conversation over to you, Ian. So welcome to the webinar today. And I'm going to get you to tell us a little bit of the story of GABA Therapeutics and in particular GRX 917. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome from sunny California, which, as you say, is 18 hours away. But that has not impacted our ability to work very effectively with the groups over there. So GABA Therapeutics is a largely virtual organization. We were funded in August of 2019 by Atai Therapeutics, and that has allowed us to move forward with the development of GRX 917. We anticipate or expect that GRX 917 will transform the treatment of patients with anxiety and depression, and also with a number of other neuropsychiatric indications. As an anxiolytic agent, we expect that GRX 917 will have the efficacy of Xanax, but without the side effects which cause problems with its use, namely sedation, ataxia, amnesia, and dependence. So GRX 917 is a new chemical entity, so you might ask, how can we say that it will have these properties? The reason that we can say this is because GRX 917 is a deuterated analog of a compound known as etifoxine, which has been on the market and approved in France and a number of other minor therapeutic pharmaceutical countries for over 40 years. Etifoxine in clinical studies has been shown to have the efficacy of Xanax and Ativan, but without the side effects. Because GRX 917 is a deuterated version of etifoxine, we know based upon a lot of precedents that it will have exactly the same biology and pharmacology, and therefore efficacy of etifoxine. But GRX 917 will have improved pharmacokinetics and metabolic properties, which means that we will be able to dose it at lower doses and less frequently.
Fantastic. Tell us a bit about the initial clinical objectives that you had around the trial.
So as I just said, etifoxine is a compound which has been approved for over 40 years in France. But interestingly, the pharmacokinetics of the compound have never been published, and the pharmacodynamics in terms of effects on potential biomarkers has never been published. This is important information, as you might imagine, for our development of GRX 917. So the very first study that we wanted to conduct was actually the study that you described in the introduction, the phase 1 study with etifoxine to understand its pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, and metabolic profile.
Excellent. And I understand that was with 30 volunteers. Was that correct?
That is correct.
Fantastic. Richard, I'm going to turn over to you now. I would like, if you wouldn't mind, just to talk a little bit about the financial rationale of why Australia, in particular, what the advantage was to GABA Therapeutics here.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Richard Farrell here. So the financial rationale was quite compelling. When you consider over the past 12 months, the AUD-USD exchange rate ranged between 0.55 and 0.75 of USD. And when you add the 43.5% tax rebate on eligible costs, we estimate our cost savings were over 50% on comparable US studies. So quite a compelling financial case.
Yeah, I'll say. And that certainly makes a big difference to the bottom line of a developing biotech.
If I could just add one thing there. I think it was interesting when we started to get bids for conducting clinical studies in Australia versus the US. We found that the US bids were about the same number, but they were in US dollars versus Australia, which is in Australian dollars. So given the exchange rate that Richard just talked about, even without the tax break, there is a significant advantage of going to Australia.
That's incredibly competitive. When you look, you've got enormous choices, from where you're both sitting. You literally, choose everywhere. And I guess you're looking at quality and you're looking at speed, but you just can't get past value. It needs to make sense from the bottom line. And yeah, it's a really compelling part of that story. Maybe if I could bring you into the conversation here, Blair, and sort of have a little bit of first of all, let's introduce CoSec to the audience. Blair, can I bring you into the conversation? Can you maybe explain CoSec for our audience and also give us an idea of how this introduction began?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. As you've introduced me already, I'm Blair Lucs, co-founder and CEO at CoSec. We did a really unexciting work in all of these clinical trials. Whilst we have my colleagues at Nucleus and 360 Biolabs who do the, as we say, the science, obviously, we are a company that essentially supports life science companies who are coming to Australia to do clinical trials, but wish to have a subsidiary company here. And that's largely because under the R&D tax incentive rules, that's the prerequisite. You must have a company in Australia that's conducting the R&D and therefore gets the benefit of the R&D tax incentive. So we usually come into these conversations further down the chain. We're one of the last pieces of the puzzle in many respects. That is, as you've rightly identified, there are fundamental reasons to come to Australia outside of the R&D tax incentive. And that is that this is a fantastic place to do high quality, cost effective already with exchange rates, and obviously very efficient clinical trials given the speed of approval in Australia compared to other countries. So many companies do come to Australia and literally engage with companies such as Nucleus and 360 Biolabs and full spectrum CROs to conduct their clinical trials in Australia. But if they want to get that cherry on the pie of the up to 43.5% cash rebate on their activities, they need a company here. So we specialize in setting up virtual entities for companies such as GABA, so that they can have a fully compliant and functioning Australian subsidiary company that itself usually acts as a sponsor of the clinical trial, conducts the R&D activities through third parties such as Nucleus and CROs and 360 Biolabs, and in doing so gets all of the benefits of this wonderful life science ecosystem we have here with the additional benefit of the R&D tax incentive.
Excellent, thank you. And tell me a little bit about the connection. So who met who?
Yeah, good question. I think, and I need to check back in my notes, I can't really remember, but I guarantee we were introduced to GABA by somebody. We
Yeah.
rarely, let me put it this way. Yeah, do you remember, guys? I don't know who it was.
I can help you. I vividly remember. So we were, when we were starting to look at CROs and placing clinical studies, we were introduced to Nathan Elia.
Ah, Nathan.
Yes. Always Nathan.
Investment and
Always
trade
Nathan.
Victoria. And we met actually at a biopartnering meeting in San Francisco, which was associated with the JP Morgan meeting. And that was in 2018. So he made the introduction to CoSec, and actually at the meeting he made the introduction to Cameron Johnson. So that's how we got introduced to Nucleus. And
Excellent.
from that we then started to talk to other organizations in Australia, including 360 Biolabs, PCI, etc., that we engaged in the study.
We used to get a lot of value out of those physical events because it literally, you end up with everybody who's anybody in the same room. So it's always a good opportunity for cross-pollination of potential leads and clients and opportunities. Yeah. So I don't know how we're going to go with not attending JP Morgan next year, but we'll see. Everything like to be done digitally.
I know, I think it's going to change everyone's behaviour, isn't it? I mean, this is great because we get to sort of sit in our own, homes and we don't have to sort of pack our bags and leave. But yeah, it's those serendipitous discussions that you get either from JP Morgan or whether it's bio or a big scientific meeting. But just, a little shout out to Nathan Elia there. So Nathan works with the Victorian Government Business Office, and I think he's on the East Coast.
Boston.
He's allowed over there sometimes. But the Victorian government and also Austrade have fantastic people on the ground in the US and throughout Europe and also Asia. So they're the matchmakers. So it's nice to see that working. So it is, sometimes it's serendipity, but sometimes, you get the opportunity to do those very direct connections.
And so, Michelle, I think it's a good indication though too how well everybody works together in this ecosystem out here. That we probably get just as many meetings at events like that, as you said, in a serendipitous manner, as we do through meetings that we've organised in advance. There is a really good collaboration and cooperation amongst all of the service providers here in Australia to make sure that the clients and the companies and the biotech companies can get the best possible opportunity and the best possible outcome.
I think that's really true to say that. What people often will comment on the Australian biotech sector and the medtech sector and make the comment that it's a very tightly networked industry. I think Australia is lucky because we're certainly big enough to have a very diverse and very expansive group of service providers, particularly around clinical trials and regulatory. But we're also small enough that we virtually know each other. So there's always a very generous, you can't do anything wrong or else somebody will find out, but there's a very generous spirit, isn't there, about that? Everybody's very welcome to say, who you should meet. And that's how it. So Ian, can I turn the conversation back to you? Can you give us a bit of insight into the regulatory time advantages of conducting a clinical trial in Australia?
Yeah, Michelle, this is, I think, a very important point, especially for small companies like GABA Therapeutics, where time is very important. So as I mentioned to you, the first study that we wanted to conduct was a study with etifoxine. And as I mentioned, etifoxine is approved in France, but it's not approved in Australia or the US. And so in those countries, it would be considered to be a new chemical entity. To conduct the clinical study in the US would require that we put together an IND, which obviously is a lot of work and very time consuming. The situation in Australia is quite different. Clinical studies with new chemical entities are conducted under the CTN scheme. In this system, basically the company needs to provide the information on the compound together with a clinical protocol. This is provided to the Human Research Ethics Committee, the HREC, and the HREC is responsible for evaluating the scientific rationale, the safety of the compound, the safety of the study, and the ethics of the study. It is not reviewed by the TGA. And so this is a very rapid and straightforward process. Significant contrast to what is required for an IND. So in the case of etifoxine, we basically provided to the ethics committee a protocol and a very simple investigator's brochure. It was only 15 pages long, which summarized information about etifoxine from the literature and from the label on the compound. We submitted that information to the HREC in October of 2019. We got basically approval in November of 2018, and then, 2019, and then we started the clinical study in the middle of January 2020. Clearly, in my view, this took probably 4 to 5 months off the timeline from doing this in the US.
Wow, that's very impressive. And of course, time is money in biotech land. So that would have made your investors very happy to see that progress at that pace. I think it's worth pointing out the CTX and the CTN scheme in Australia because it is a significant advantage in being able to speed up the initiation of trials. Angela, maybe can I call on you and bring you in here and maybe introduce us a little bit to 360 Biolabs. And if you could talk a little about how you came in to support GABA Therapeutics.
Yeah, sure. So 360 Biolabs is a specialty lab, as we were introduced before, offering PK and PD assays. So we were in touch with the GABA team, possibly not as late as Blair, but possibly a couple of weeks later, because bioanalytical labs are always engaged at the last minute. We have our CRO, we have our clinical sites. Oh, we need a lab now. So we do tend to maintain a very fast startup time, 4 to 6 weeks to get assays developed and validated and ready for the clinic. And we do tend to run that development and validation time right up to the clinical start. So it's a very streamlined process from our perspective.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah, so they're sort of reinforcing there those time advantages. But also, I think it's important to point out too the location. So when we think about 360 Biolabs and Nucleus Network in Melbourne, you're really physically close. And I guess that's a significant advantage too, not just knowing everybody, Angela, but sort of being in the physical geography sort of makes sense. It's interesting, Australia is very much organised into precincts, particularly around teaching hospitals, but we have some pretty extraordinary and really deep and very well experienced clusters across Australia in almost every capital city. Richard, can I bring you back in here and tell us a little bit of how you structured the Australian operation?
Sure. So I understand there's a few different structures that are available. As Blair indicated, you must form an Australian entity, which we call GABA Therapeutics Australia, Pty Limited. We then license that subsidiary, again, it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the parent, the right to develop and commercialize GRX 917 in the Australian territory. The parent then lends that subsidiary capital to develop the compound via unsecured loans. And in exchange for that, this is an unusual structure, I will say, the Australian subsidiary agrees to pay the parent a 5% royalty on future revenues in perpetuity. Importantly for us, because we intend to IPO, all intellectual property resides with the parent. So that's our that's how we structured this.
Critical, yeah, critical in that way. And I think it's important, yeah, to point out that this is essential in being able to access the Australian R&D tax incentive scheme. But I think people like Blair, I think, are very, very familiar with how to set this up and can do that in a pretty speedy way. Would that be right to say that, Blair?
Yeah, we like to get things done as quickly as we can. I mean, it normally takes, we say 2 to 4 weeks to have everything set up and ready to go. which is largely, that time delay as such is largely due to the requirement to pass KYC checks with banks and verification of overseas directors with the tax authority. So it's usually the 2 to 4 weeks is due to documents going backwards and forwards in the air between countries. But it from our side, we've been doing this now for almost 10 years. And we currently act for, I think it's 108 life science companies doing work in Australia, or I'm pleased to say actually maybe not even doing work. They've had a very successful experience here and are maintaining their subsidiary for the next drug asset they want to do some work on here, or later phase trials here. So we've managed to perfect our model, I suppose, to ensure that it's efficient, for sure. It's a primary objective, but also it's a low risk model for our clients. We recognize that our clients are ultimately looking to obtain good clinical trial data. That's the primary objective, and to ensure that they can obviously maximize the benefit that's available to them under the R&D tax incentive, but to not be too greedy and raise their risk profile as a result. I think it was an American client who once said to me, "Pigs get fat, but hogs get slaughtered." And so we make sure that our clients are pigs, but not hogs in that regard. There's no point in trying to be too clever.
That's very funny. That's very appropriate. Maybe let's just touch on the Australian R&D tax incentive. So we had some good news recently in the Australian budget that was just brought down last week. So it looks like the government's investing $2 billion into the R&D tax incentive, and the value continues. Certainly, the government's very clearly and directly recognised the clinical trial industry as one of the key industries that will drive economic growth and development out of COVID. Can you make a comment on that?
Yeah, look, I was really excited to see that. I mean, we've dealt with now since 2018, I think, a couple of attempts to try and claw back some value from the R&D tax incentive program by the current federal government. And whilst the first attempt failed and the second one was up in front of a Senate subcommittee for review, it was less and keep in mind, in fact, the changes themselves were not really going to affect the clinical trial
Absolutely true.
business, simply because they were exempt from a lot of the restrictions that were being put in place. Nonetheless, it's that uncertainty that making continual changes brings that we found the most damaging. And that is, we always want to emphasize that Australia is a great place to do this kind of work, that there is strong government support for it. So every time there's a change that the government wants to bring in, it undermines that value proposition. So the changes that were announced in the federal budget last week to us are fantastic, because it is a direct validation by the federal government, not only of the value of R&D to the Australian economy, but especially in the post-COVID era, but certainly within the clinical trial space. So we're waiting to interpret the legislation to see how it plays out, but at the very least, we can say that the benefits will be maintained. At the very best, we can say that it's actually the government really putting some support behind this program and behind the R&D tax incentive itself.
I think that's true. I was very encouraged to hear the Prime Minister directly refer to the clinical trial industry as a primary industry in which he wanted to see growth and expansion, particularly in overseas markets. So, yeah, I was doing a little happy dance over that, because I thought, thank goodness, you know, there is that certainty. But I think another important point to point out that in the budget, in terms of eligible expenditure, they've increased it from 100 million to 150 million. So I think there's some very clear messages here from the federal government in terms of stability, but also that continued investment in infrastructure. So that was another key point that was made in the budget around continuing to invest in the infrastructure around our healthcare system that can drive economic growth. That, I think, is a really good news story.
And look, I think the numbers tell the story. I mean, as I said, we act for 108 companies here at the moment. We're not a big company. So I'm sure we don't have a majority of the companies that are coming to Australia to do this type of work. So it's a really strong part of the Australian economy. And the fact that we have clients who continually come back to us to run another trial, another study, a later phase study, is a direct validation of the work that's done by everybody who works in this ecosystem in Australia. So yeah, look, we often get the question, you know, can you guarantee the R&D tax incentive will remain? I say, no, it's a tax policy. You can't guarantee this in any country. But the statements and the support that was given to the R&D tax incentive, and specifically the clinical trial business in Australia last week was really rewarding in that regard.
I think it's also worth pointing out just the quality of our healthcare systems. So I think Australia has one of those healthcare systems in the world that everybody wishes they had. And certainly every time I travel to the US, I always comment on this, and I'm so proud of it. I'm ridiculous. It's crazy. Well, it is a system in which we have major teaching hospitals spread around the country. And I'm going to bring Paul in from Nucleus Network in a minute to talk about this, because they're located beside one of the biggest teaching hospitals in Melbourne. But this is around the quality of the people that we have in Australia, but also the infrastructure that's available to do, not just phase 1 studies, and there's some extraordinary phase 1 study sites right around the country, but also to do those more complex phase 2 and phase 3 studies. We've certainly got the experience and the dedicated staff. And I was also pleased to see a recent industry report saying that the number of people working in the clinical trial sector continues to grow, and that we're attracting talent from overseas. So I think in a COVID clean environment, which Australia really kind of is, compared to other places in the world, I think it's a really great opportunity. Richard, I'm going to come back to you and get you to explain a little bit more about, characterise maybe your experience to date with working with the Australian businesses that we're talking to today.
Sure. So from a CFO perspective, the cost is a no-brainer. As I mentioned, we estimate more than a 50% discount on comparable studies in the US. From compliance perspective, I will say CoSec has been outstanding at helping us administer all compliance matters ongoing, whether it's ASIC, ATO, banking, tax rebate submissions, and so on. They've really made that efficient and quite simple to manage. And the third point I guess I'd make is convenience. I couldn't imagine embarking upon a program like this, notwithstanding that I used to be an investment banker in Sydney, without having a turnkey solution that we've been provided with by CoSec and the other vendors like 360 and Nucleus and so on. So for us, it's been a great experience, to say the least.
It's good to hear you say that, because I think, just when you think about the complexities of setting up an Australian operation here to be able to implement these kind of efficiencies, I guess what would be your advice to other CFOs in the sector? Do you think, they may look at that and say, wow, how do we navigate that?
Well, absolutely. As I say, it really is a turnkey solution. The administrative processes that CoSec could not execute themselves, they recommended vendors, and all of the vendors we've used so far, we've been very pleased with. Whether it was the tax attorney, we used KPMG to do what's called a commercial rationale study in Melbourne. It was outstanding. So it really was a turnkey solution for us, and it was quick and it was efficient. Yep.
That's great. And I understand that CoSec also make all the, in terms of ongoing compliance, they make all the necessary submissions. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So what I get emails actually quite regularly from one of the CoSec members, Leanne, and she makes it simple and efficient, whether they're questionnaires or whatever's required. And we just know that compliance is being properly managed ongoing. So,
thanks, Richard. I think it's worth pointing out that all of us out here are so used to dealing with companies that are 18 hours away, and I think that's often one of the questions is, and we don't necessarily get it from the US too much. I mean, the US companies have been doing so much work in Australia for so long that they're familiar with, let's say, the challenges of the time difference, but we get it from the other side of the globe, over in Europe a lot. It's like, how can we possibly do this work in Australia? We're 7 hours away, we're 10 hours away. And the fact is, this is what we do. Whilst we have a very strong Australian life science industry itself in terms of biotech companies, nonetheless, engaging with companies from abroad is one of the key strengths of the Australian clinical trial ecosystem. So it might seem like it's a long way away geographically, and we are, And it may seem like we're a long way away in terms of time, but this is our core business. And when I say our, I'm not only talking about CoSec, I'm talking about 360, I'm talking about Nucleus, I'm talking about the CROs, I'm talking about everybody in this ecosystem out here.
Yeah.
We have an ongoing joke at 360 that we're always one step ahead. While you're sleeping
in the future,
while we're delivering in your inbox by the next morning when you wake up.
Exactly.
That's nice. Can we just touch on that, Angela? Because I think, I too work with companies in Europe, and I quite like the idea of waking up and seeing all this work done in my inbox. So, in terms of that value proposition, talk us through a little bit around that with 360 Biolabs in working in a 24-hour time cycle.
Yeah, because we're doing more and more out of hours analysis these days, because sampling time points are going through 16 to 18 hours, so it's through the night. We do find that the efficiencies that you have by being 12 hours ahead from most countries, it does mean that Sunday morning, by the time people are getting ready to get up and get to work on the Monday morning in the US, Australia's already finished their workday on Monday. If the deliverables due that day, they've already set those results. And it's just a really nice way of being able to say, we're on top of this and we've got this.
I agree with you. I think it feels really successful, particularly if you're US side or European side and you wake up to all this lovely stuff in your inbox. Yeah. How good does that feel, particularly on a Monday morning, and you think, the Australians have done half the work already. That's good.
Which is why we also like Mondays, because it's Sunday in the US, which means everybody's still sleeping, so we can get work done.
You can get ahead of the game, can't you? Because quick, get all the stuff into their inbox, and it's like, oh, here we are. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Maybe Blair and Angela, talk a little bit about, I think, CoSec is so critical for that matchmaker role as well. But obviously you two have worked together a lot on a lot of clients across a lot of different therapeutic areas and a lot of different kinds of study designs as well.
Yeah, we probably work together more than we want to in many respects. We've been on a lot of trade missions together, a lot of meals together, a lot of meetings together. But I think, I think the relationship between CoSec and 360 Biolabs is pretty much indicative of the relationships that we all have in the market. And, it's a very, like I said, it's a very collaborative market. Whilst we all work with certain parties more naturally by virtue of, for example, geography. I mean, us being in Melbourne mean that obviously a lot of our clients would want to use a lab in Melbourne. But nonetheless, we all work with everybody from the top of the country in Brisbane down to the bottom of the country in Melbourne and across to Perth. It's a very open and transparent, I suppose, in many respects, sort of collaboration or ecosystem in that regard. But yeah, Ange probably knows much more about the kinds of work we've done. I certainly know the companies, but I got to be brutally honest and say I generally don't understand what most of our clients are doing. That's the least of my concerns. I just want to make sure it's all set up so they can do what they want to. But I'm sure Ange knows very much the sort of depth of studies and different studies that we've worked on together.
Yeah. And I also want to bring in and just touch on that trade mission comment that you made, Blair. The Victorian government is very supportive of R&D, probably the strongest government in Australia. So they do provide this fabulous opportunity for companies in Victoria to come together, move into new markets, travel together, do trade missions. And so we do find that the relationships in Victoria with the collaborators are a little stronger because we do work together a lot. Obviously, Australia, we sell Australia, not just Victoria. So we work with all of the different phase 1 units and clinical CROs around Australia. But Victoria is certainly strong and is well backed by the Victorian government to continue this export and strong export proposition, which is clinical trials in Australia.
And don't forget they have people like, as we've already mentioned, Nathan over in Boston, who are just dynamite. The teams across I think they have 23 offices globally now, Victoria, which is the largest number by far of any of the state governments. And the people in those offices can be real dynamite in terms of their knowledge of the the industry sectors in the countries they're based in, but also in terms of being really efficient and really forthcoming in terms of introducing us, for example, to companies that are interested in doing this work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think Nathan is definitely buying all of us drinks next time, because he so owes us. I think that's a really important point to point out that there are Victorian government business offices in San Francisco, and I think Nathan's based over in Massachusetts. There's certain people all throughout Europe and also Asia and Asia Pac and the Middle East. And they are an extraordinary team. There's real depth in that. I think too that just that concept of Australians are very good at getting on a plane and making that connection, and I've been really impressed. Used to be, yeah. I've been really impressed the way Australians have taken to the digital landscape. So I want to just touch on a couple of points here, and it's probably a good time to bring Paul into this conversation from Nucleus Network, is because Australia has been relatively COVID-free. And we've been able to get not just a suppression effect, but almost an elimination effect. There's significant advantages here in creating that opportunity to bring clinical trials into Australia and to continue, because recruitment is not a problem. So I think too that when we talk about recruitment, this is one of the biggest issues for all biotech companies, and particularly as they get through into phase 2, phase 3. Can you maybe talk about the experience of recruitment, Ian? And obviously it was pretty seamless, though it's a phase 1, it's a reasonably small population of healthy volunteers, but it's critical to the success of getting that trial up and going fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective, Nucleus was very good at projecting how rapidly they would be able to enroll the normal volunteers in this study, and they certainly met those timelines, which were very good. So, I think that's really important, that the unit doing the study can make good projections about timelines for doing these types of things, and they certainly were able to do that. We're going to be interested in looking at abilities to recruit patients at some point. And I think that then will get us into some of the other infrastructure within Australia, some of the teaching hospitals, etc. That's something that we will be looking into in the near future.
That's good to hear. That's great. And tell us a little bit about, in terms of the amount of the reporting that you got from Nucleus Network. Of course, I can imagine what it's like as the founder of a biotech company, and you're getting something into the clinic. It's like you're sending off your baby to college, isn't it? You kind of want to hear every now and then that everything's going well. Tell us a little bit about the communication style of Nucleus Network.
They are very open and frequent with their communications. I should say that we have engaged a consultant that we have on the ground in Australia to help coordinate some of these activities and prod whenever necessary. But in general, we didn't find that was necessary. The communication is very forthcoming. Any issues, missed time points or whatever, we were notified of very readily. So I found it to be a very open and transparent and effective communication. As you have been talking about, the 18-hour time difference is not really an issue for us. And another advantage is that more or less you speak the same language.
More or less.
More or less.
More or less. But I think that it helps to have probably Richard in the business, because he speaks Australian. I know you do, Richard.
G'day, mate.
No, but I have nothing but positive things to say about Nucleus and 360 Biolabs. And I suppose the sort of the point here is that we're now in the process of planning to run another phase 1 study now with GRX-917 with Nucleus, with 360. And we're now in the process of generating the toxicology data that will be needed to enable that study. We're anticipating getting that in draft reports in January of 2021. We plan to drop that into the investigator's brochure submitted to the HREC February 22nd, and then be in man in the end of March, beginning of April.
That's good news for us. Nice to hear.
That's good. You can hang your hat on that.
Yeah, look, I think it's the best validation we always get. You know, clients come to us, as I'm sure they do to all of us here, planning one study. I was like, this is what we need to do. But I think when they discover when they discover in practice how easy, how efficient, how straightforward it is to do work here, you know, we very, very rarely have a client that does one study and then packs up shop and goes home as such.
Right.
And that's generally only if they've had a negative experience, not with Australia, but a negative experience with their clinical trial program. Something's gone wrong. Hasn't been worth it. They haven't been able to progress. But assuming they have at the baseline a reasonable experience in terms of the drug, the clinical trial performance as such, then they stay and they do further trials, and that's really, I think, the best way to demonstrate how good it is here. Right. You wouldn't stay and you wouldn't do more work here if it was not a satisfactory experience.
Right. And I wouldn't do work there even if it was less expensive, unless it was good quality. And you know, all the work we've had done there meets all of the appropriate quality requirements and is perfectly good for submission to the FDA, which we plan to do. So that's really important.
And that's what we say. And, you know, I mean, it's the R&D tax incentive itself is great, but if the fundamentals of this ecosystem out here meant that you couldn't get the kind of data you want, meant you couldn't get the kind of quality results you want, meant you couldn't do it within an efficient time frame, then they could offer you the government could offer you 150% back of your spend here, and you still wouldn't come. So, you know, that in and of itself, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to labour here too. It's around quality. So I don't think Australia has ever promoted the fact that we're the cheapest. We're definitely not the cheapest. In terms of the most reliable, the most secure, and certainly the most skilled, I think they're the key messages around the Australian clinical trial sector that are far more accurate and certainly far more the international biotechs and medtechs want to hear. Because it's not about getting the cheapest, it's about getting the best. And I think that's the message here too. I think it's worth labouring to the security issues around data, that this is a key point that the government's been talking about in Australia around cyber risk and cyber security. And I was really pleased to see just recently in a cyber security report and Australia's cyber security and risk strategy that the healthcare system is listed #1 as the key industry in which, you know, the government wants to continue to invest, because, you know, this whole sector relies on security and quality of data, doesn't it? So, you know, it's interesting to see that. I just wanted to touch on the concept too around just touching COVID and thinking about that. You know, that sort of would have thrown a spanner in the works of a lot of clinical trials around the world, but not so much in Australia. Angela, can I bring you into this conversation? I've been really pleased to see that recruitment and the initiation of clinical trials in Australia, really, there was a slight blip probably around about April, but it just doesn't seem to have been sustained. Is that your experience?
Yes, exactly. So from March, when COVID hit our shores, we were all waiting to see whether the same thing that was happening across the rest of the world was going to happen in Australia. We're all getting ready for the phase 1 units to shut down, for clinical trials to slow down. And that never happened. By the middle of the year, everyone was recruiting as usual. Studies were continuing to maintain timelines. And even now, because Australia has essentially, as you mentioned before, squashed COVID in Australia, we are seeing a massive influx of studies coming into Australia that can't be conducted in other parts of the world, in particular the US. So it is very attractive just because of the way our government has handled the COVID situation.
I think it's also important to point out how well the clinical trial sector in Australia has adapted to digital technologies. So this is everything from telehealth through to the capturing of data through wearables and various digital platforms, but also really encouraging to see clinical trials in the home. So we're seeing far more people in Australia get access now to participate in clinical trials. So with a population that is actually quite spread out, this is critical to our success. So frankly, personally, I'm just really proud of the sector having jumped into the digital landscape and just embraced it with a huge degree of enthusiasm, which I think says a lot about Australia's ability to adopt new technologies and adapt.
Yeah, I think a good example of that, Michelle, is some phase 1 units were able to devise a system to keep their units safe by sending out tests to subjects that they were expecting to recruit to have a nasopharyngeal and get tested and confirm their negativity or COVID negativity before they come into the unit. So Australia and the units within Australia did adapt very quickly to ensure the safety of their workers and their workplaces, but also the continuation of the sector.
And we've certainly seen, the results of that being the initiation of new studies continuing, the no interruption to major clinical trials that are going on. And I think Australia, when we look back in a year from now, I think that's actually going to be a really good story. Fingers crossed that Australia's been able to avoid interruption to the clinical trial opportunity that is there for everyone to access. So, Paul, can I bring you into this conversation? Can you give us a little bit of a quick overview of Nucleus Network and then maybe touch on how you connected to GABA Therapeutics?
Sure. So Nucleus Network is Australia's largest phase 1 company. So, we're a contract research organisation that specialises particularly in phase 1 trials with sites in Melbourne and Brisbane, as well as a US site. And so our bread and butter, our core business is doing phase 1 clinical trials well. And so we've done a very large number of trials over a long period of time with very experienced investigators in all therapeutic areas. So I'm an infectious disease physician, so my area of expertise a little bit is in vaccines, but we certainly have a lot of experience and expertise in basically all therapeutic areas, including this one, for example.
So tell me a little bit about the connection to GABA Therapeutics. And I think you were introduced by CoSec.
Yeah, I believe that's right. I mean, I don't know the full background in terms of the introduction, but, I do know that Nucleus Network has a great reputation for working with companies like this. And so, we do our best to support, all investigational products and companies that make them, from novel biotech all the way through to big pharma, and really like working with companies like GABA.
So tell us a little bit about the locations. So I mentioned just before that Nucleus Network is located in Melbourne, at least, right beside one of the major teaching hospitals in Victoria, and also in Brisbane. You're in a really strong biotech and clinical trials network up there as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in both of our locations in Australia, we're part of very large campuses that have world-leading hospitals on site, as well as large research organisations as well. So that's one of our big strengths, because we're supported by those clinical services from those large hospitals if needed, and we have access to a lot of expertise in the research and science space as well. So, and for a large number of our projects, we collaborate with a lot of our scientific partners at those locations as well.
Australia's fairly lucky because we do have pretty extraordinary clinical trial workforce, don't we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we've got great infrastructure here. We've got, I failed to mention in my last answer, 360 biolabs obviously on site with our Melbourne site that give us great support, and we work very well together. So I think partly through the infrastructure that we have, as well as the people, as well as our regulatory system, Australia is certainly recognised as a great place to do particularly early phase research.
Maybe if I could get you to maybe comment on the speed in which particularly phase 1s are initiated through Nucleus. So GABA had a very speedy initiation into beginning that trial, but that's not unusual. We like to say that that's business as usual in Australia. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's right. So as a specialist phase 1 unit, we have a large team that help with our regulatory submissions to be able to do that really quickly. And we know that time is money basically in clinical trials. And, once somebody has an exciting product like this that's ready to go to the clinic, any delays there are really frustrating, and obviously can have a big cost and obviously a big impact on timelines. So we do everything we can to, from when we first initiate discussions or meet with clients, to get their study up and running as quickly as possible. And with our large team and our big track record and our collaborating partners that we've discussed, we are typically able to do that quite quickly.
I think one of the key features is also harmonisation and connectivity with human research ethics committees. Can you talk a little bit about the Nucleus experience?
Yeah, so we have great relationships with a few ethics committees that we work with. Obviously, the Alfred in Victoria, but we also have a great working relationship with a large private ethics company in Australia. And so through those ongoing relationships, we can work really well with them to make sure that trials start as quickly as possible. And often we don't need to have a number of cycles of resubmission and waiting for subsequent meetings, because we know what information needs to be provided, and we're used to providing that in a way that works for them. So we can often get trials up and running quite quickly.
Can you make just one final comment too, just around the quality of data capture, data security, and how well the workforce at Nucleus Network have adapted to the COVID restrictions, which really haven't interrupted a lot of the play in this space?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we know as a phase 1 clinical trials company that our data is our product. And so that's what we take great pride in making sure is of the utmost quality. Obviously, in addition to a focus on subject safety as our other key focus there. And so, as a large phase 1 company, we have a lot of expertise and in our data teams whose core business is actually making sure we collect and store and report on the data in the way that is required with a high degree of accuracy. And in terms of COVID. We've been able to keep operating, not quite business as usual, but almost on the same scale, obviously with a lot of safeguards in place, including testing and mask wearing and robust infection control and screening. And through that, we've been able to continue to operate throughout the COVID crisis. And I guess it's also highlights one of our strengths in terms of having locations in Brisbane and Melbourne. So we saw that epidemiology in Melbourne was quite dire for a period of time. So we're able to make sure we can continue operating outside of our Brisbane site with a bit of a focus on up there. And then as things come back under control in Melbourne, we can once again scale up some of our activity there. So it means we have a lot of flexibility in how we operate, having 2 sites in different locations in this country.
I think you're giving me confidence because you're an infectious diseases expert, Paul, that I think you've got infection control under control.
Yeah, that is something that I do. So fortunately, it was good that those skills could help us continue to operate as we have done.
We've got skills. Now, we're going to give you the opportunity for a final comment here, Paul. So, in wrapping all of this up, this whole discussion, maybe do you want to make one final comment about the opportunity that Australia offers, and particularly the advantage of Nucleus Network and the relationships that you've got?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, obviously, with this excellent panel, it highlights the kind of people that we're able to collaborate with, and through those sort of working relationships and our location and expertise and experience in this area, in addition to Australia, obviously more broadly being a great country to do these sort of clinical trials, I guess it really highlights how well this can work, and shows what can happen when the right people get together.
I know, that's the magic of it, isn't it? Yeah, the right people getting together at the right time in the right place.
Exactly right.
So in conclusion, today you've heard a really great story about GABA Therapeutics and how they've been able to really leverage the phase 1 opportunity in Australia, but also talking a little bit more about the detail of how that happened. So I want to say thank you both to you, Ian and Richard, and maybe give you the opportunity to offer some concluding remarks or maybe a little bit of advice to any biotechs or medtechs thinking about Australia as a clinical trial destination. Ian.
So thank you, Michelle. I think that our experience with running our first phase 1 study in Australia with a new chemical entity was very positive. We found that it is much quicker and simpler to get approval to go into phase 1 studies and or phase 2 studies with new chemical entities in Australia than it is in, for example, the US. We found that the cost of the study is about half that in Australia compared to the US, and the quality we have found to be exceptionally good. So we have no concerns about submitting reports to the FDA with appropriate compliance. So I think that from my position as with a CEO hat on, it represents a great opportunity to undertake studies in Australia. And as I'm sure Richard will point out, it really is relatively straightforward with the help of CoSec to set this up in the US and to benefit from the tax returns or tax returns that are available in Australia.
Fantastic, thank you. And Richard, do you want to jump in here with a final comment?
Sure. So as Ian just said, the cost benefit is very compelling. The convenience factor is excellent. It's a truly turnkey solution in terms of administering the process from a CFO compliance perspective. It's very convenient, and if we were to do it again, we would certainly go down this track. So highly recommend it to any biotechs looking to conduct studies.
Thank you, that's great. And I'm going to turn to you now, Angela. Maybe sort of, give us a little bit of a wrap up here and a pitch, a call to action of why Australia and to get on the phone and start talking to you.
Probably one of my most exciting parts of the job is when I get an email from Ian and his team saying, we're coming back, we're coming to do another one, are you ready to get started again? Yeah, so it's that relationship that you build, and then the connection, and then also that repeat clientele with teams that you enjoy working with, which is really a huge attraction for 360 Biolabs and the types of teams that we really like to work with. Those that are prepared to work as a collaboration and not just you're a CRO, we pay you your fee for service, just a really nice collaboration, and that's what it's been with the GABA team. And I encourage other biotech companies to come and have that experience in Australia with 360.
That's great, and I know the 360 team are absolutely fantastic, and particularly you, Angela. It's so much about the people you work with, isn't it? It's about the relationship and how easy it is to raise issues and get a response, and to celebrate those successes together as well. Blair, you've got the final say, so I'm going to throw it over to you. So you did the big wrap up for me. Say how great Australia. No. Maybe conclude about where the opportunities are, and particularly the role of CoSec in being that connector, that critical connector and enabler in the sector.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's very little I can add to that which Ian and Richard and Ange have already said. But obviously, GABA is a really good example of what benefits you can obtain as a biotech company that's looking to accelerate your drug development program by using Australia. But by no means is GABA unusual in that context, apart from the fact that they're wonderful to work with. This experience that they're outlining is the standard experience for biotech companies that come to Australia. And I think that, there's many examples we have of clients who have come to Australia and completed a phase 1 study before their competitors have had the IND for a phase 1 study approved in the US. And as you said, time is money, but also, it's a good, positive, enjoyable working experience engaging with our clients find engaging with us here and vice versa. So we warmly encourage any inquiries. We'd be happy to help more. We do have capacity. We do have patience. We do have an ecosystem that's functioning very well during these otherwise challenging times. So please feel free to reach out.
That's great. I think the key message there is that Ian and Richard, you're not special. This is the normal.
I didn't mean it that way.
Don't get too much work.
But no, you are special. Every client is special, and yes, that's true. But what a fantastic way to wrap up. I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity to hear a story from a company like GABA Therapeutics that's chosen Australia, and to get a little bit of insight and introduction into some of the extraordinary service providers that make up our ecosystem here. So don't forget to connect with us, all of us on the panel. Certainly send in any questions that you've got and we'll see if we can answer them. If not in real time, certainly we'll follow up with you. Knock on the door. Australia's actually not that far away, and particularly in times of COVID, we're really only a click away. It's really not, what did we say at the start? 3,700 miles or something. It was more than that.
7,300.
7,300.
We're really not that far away. We're really only a click away. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for joining us on this webinar. And we wish you all a very safe and happy working week. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you to the speakers and Michelle for that fantastic presentation. And of course, thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. If you have further questions, direct them to the email addresses on your screen. So go ahead, quickly jot those down. And a survey window will be popping up on your screens as well. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event on that page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers again for that wonderful presentation. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.